In 1997, Sunday mornings in Riverside had a sacred rhythm. The bells of St. Matthew's Cathedral would ring at exactly 9:30 a.m., calling the faithful to the most attended service in the city. Among the familiar faces that filled the wooden pews every week, 17-year-old Emma Willis stood out like a ray of sunshine. Her golden hair caught the light streaming through the stained glass windows, and her bright blue eyes reflected a determination that impressed everyone who knew her. Emma wasn't just another teenager going through the motions of Sunday service. She carried thick medical textbooks in her backpack, studying between hymns and prayers. Her dream of becoming a doctor consumed every free moment, and even in church, she would quietly review anatomy notes during the longer sermons. Pastor Williams had grown accustomed to seeing her in the third pew from the front, always on the right side, always with her mother Margaret. Margaret Willis watched her daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. At 42, she had raised Emma alone since her husband's passing when Emma was 12. The girl's academic brilliance was undeniable. She had already been accepted to 3 pre-med programs and was waiting to hear from Harvard. But Margaret worried about the pressure Emma put on herself, the way she studied until her eyes were red with exhaustion, the way she seemed to carry the weight of their future on her young shoulders. That particular Sunday, October 12, 1997, started like any other. Emma woke at 6 a.m. as always, and spent 2 hours reviewing organic chemistry before getting dressed for church. She wore her favorite blue dress, the one that matched her eyes, and tied her hair back with a simple white ribbon. Margaret made pancakes, Emma's favorite, but the girl barely touched them, too focused on a particularly challenging chapter about cellular respiration. "You need to eat, sweetheart," Margaret said, watching Emma push the food around her plate while reading. "Your brain needs fuel too." Emma looked up and smiled, that radiant smile that could light up any room. "I know, Mom. I'm just nervous about the MCAT prep course starting next week. I want to be ready." The drive to St. Matthew's Cathedral took exactly 12 minutes. Emma spent the time quizzing herself with flashcards, while Margaret navigated the familiar streets lined with maple trees just beginning to show their autumn colors. The cathedral's imposing Gothic architecture came into view, its twin spires reaching toward a gray October sky that threatened rain. They arrived at 9:15 a.m., as they had every Sunday for the past 5 years. Emma carried her backpack, heavy with textbooks and dreams, while Margaret held her worn leather purse and the small Bible that had belonged to her mother. They greeted the other parishioners with warm smiles and took their usual seats in the third pew. The service began with the opening hymn, "Amazing Grace." Emma's clear soprano voice rose above the congregation, a sound that Pastor Williams later said he would never forget. During the first reading, she discreetly opened her biochemistry textbook, balancing her spiritual duties with her academic ambitions in a way that had become second nature. At 10:47 a.m. during Pastor Williams' sermon about faith in times of uncertainty, Emma quietly stood up. Margaret assumed she was going to the restroom, something Emma occasionally did during the longer sermons when her studying had left her with a headache. Emma squeezed past the other parishioners in their pew, her movements careful and respectful, her backpack still slung over her shoulder. She walked down the center aisle, her footsteps silent on the thick red carpet. Several people noticed her: Mrs. Henderson from the choir, young Timothy Morrison, who had harbored a secret crush on Emma for months, and old Mr. Garrett, who sat in the back pew and seemed to notice everything. Emma reached the heavy wooden doors at the back of the cathedral, pushed them open with a soft creak, and stepped into the gray morning light. That was the last time anyone saw Emma Willis. When Margaret realized Emma hadn't returned after 20 minutes, a cold dread settled in her stomach. She excused herself and walked to the women's restroom, her heels clicking against the marble floor with increasing urgency. Empty. She checked the fellowship hall, the library, even the small prayer chapel behind the altar. Nothing. Outside, the October air had grown colder, and a light drizzle had begun to fall. Margaret called Emma's name, her voice echoing off the cathedral's stone walls. The parking lot was full of cars, but Emma was nowhere to be seen. Margaret's hands trembled as she approached other church members who were beginning to leave after the service. "Have you seen Emma?" she asked Mrs. Henderson, trying to keep the panic from her voice. "She walked out during the sermon, dear. I thought she might be feeling unwell." Margaret's world began to tilt. Emma never left church early. Never. She was too respectful, too disciplined, too focused on maintaining the perfect record that would secure her future in medicine. The police arrived at 2:30 p.m. Officer Daniel Rodriguez, a man in his 30s with kind eyes and a methodical approach, took Margaret's statement in the cathedral's office. Pastor Williams sat beside them, his usually steady hands shaking as he poured coffee that no one would drink. "Tell me about Emma's state of mind lately," Officer Rodriguez said gently. "Any changes in behavior? Problems at school? Boyfriend troubles?" Margaret shook her head vigorously. "Emma doesn't have time for boyfriends. She's completely focused on her studies. She's been accepted to 3 pre-med programs and is waiting to hear from Harvard. She would never just leave." The search began immediately. Volunteers from the congregation combed the surrounding neighborhoods, calling Emma's name until their voices were hoarse. Her photograph, the one from her senior portrait where she wore a soft smile and her hair fell in golden waves around her shoulders, was distributed to every business within a 5-mile radius. Days turned into weeks. Margaret barely slept, surviving on coffee and the casseroles that well-meaning church members continued to bring. Emma's bedroom remained exactly as she had left it. Textbooks open on her desk, her acceptance letters pinned to a bulletin board, her white ribbon still lying on the dresser where she had placed it that Sunday morning. The investigation yielded nothing substantial. Emma's bank account remained untouched. Her car was still in the church parking lot, keys in Margaret's purse. Security cameras from nearby businesses showed nothing unusual. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. Detective Sarah Chen took over the case in November. A sharp woman with 15 years of experience, she interviewed everyone who had been at the cathedral that morning. Timothy Morrison admitted to watching Emma leave but said she seemed normal, maybe a little tired. Mr. Garrett remembered seeing her walk out but noticed nothing suspicious. The investigation expanded to include Emma's classmates, teachers, and even distant relatives. "Sometimes people just need to disappear for a while," Detective Chen told Margaret during one of their monthly meetings. "Especially young people under pressure. The stress of college applications, family expectations. You don't understand," Margaret interrupted, her voice breaking. "Emma isn't just any teenager. She's been planning her future since she was 12 years old. She has goals, dreams. She would never abandon everything she's worked for." Christmas came and went. Margaret set a place for Emma at the dinner table, her daughter's favorite cranberry sauce growing cold in its bowl. New Year's Eve passed in silence. Emma's 18th birthday in February was marked only by Margaret lighting a single candle and whispering prayers into the empty house. The media attention faded. Emma's case was filed away with hundreds of other missing persons reports. Detective Chen was reassigned to new cases. The volunteers stopped calling. Life in Riverside moved on, but Margaret remained frozen in that October morning, waiting for her daughter to walk back through those cathedral doors. Years passed like pages turning in a book Margaret couldn't bear to read. Emma's acceptance letter from Harvard arrived in April 1998, 4 months too late. Margaret kept it unopened on the kitchen counter for 2 years before finally putting it away with Emma's other belongings. The pre-med program Emma had planned to attend sent condolence flowers when they learned of her disappearance. Margaret aged rapidly, her brown hair turning gray, lines etching themselves around her eyes from countless sleepless nights. She continued attending St. Matthew's Cathedral every Sunday, sitting in the same third pew, but now she sat alone. The space where Emma used to study her medical textbooks remained empty, a constant reminder of dreams interrupted and a future stolen. By 2010, most people had forgotten about Emma Willis. New tragedies had captured the community's attention. New mysteries had replaced old ones. But Margaret never stopped believing that somewhere, somehow, her brilliant daughter was still alive, still fighting to come home. October 12, 2019. 22 years to the day since Emma Willis had walked out of St. Matthew's Cathedral and vanished into the gray morning mist. Margaret, now 64 with silver hair and hands weathered by decades of worry, still attended the same Sunday service. She sat in the third pew, but now on the left side. She could no longer bear to occupy the exact spot where she and Emma had shared their last moments together. The cathedral had undergone renovations over the years. New carpet, updated sound system, fresh paint on the walls. But the essence remained the same. The towering stained glass windows, the heavy wooden doors, the sense of sanctuary that had drawn the Willis family for so many years. Pastor Williams had retired 5 years earlier, replaced by a younger minister named Pastor Sarah Mitchell. She knew Margaret's story, as did most of the longtime congregation members. They had learned to give Margaret space for her grief, while still offering quiet support through their presence. That morning, as Pastor Mitchell delivered her sermon about hope in the face of uncertainty, a maintenance worker named Carlos Mendez was performing routine cleaning in the cathedral's basement storage area. The basement housed old furniture, seasonal decorations, and boxes of church records dating back decades. It was a space rarely visited except for storage purposes. Carlos was moving a heavy wooden cabinet that hadn't been touched in years when he heard something small clatter to the floor behind it. The sound was metallic, distinct against the concrete floor. He bent down with his flashlight and saw a small black object wedged between the wall and the cabinet's base. It was a pager, an old Motorola model from the 1990s, its black plastic case scratched and dusty. Carlos picked it up, surprised to find such an outdated device in the church basement. The LCD screen was dark, the battery long dead after more than 2 decades, but there was something else. A small piece of masking tape on the back with numbers written in faded blue ink. 4, 7, 15, 20, 8. Carlos brought the pager to Pastor Mitchell after the service ended. She examined it with curiosity, turning it over in her hands. The numbers on the tape meant nothing to her, but something about finding it in the cathedral felt significant. "Should I throw it away?" Carlos asked. "It's just old junk, probably left behind during one of the renovations." Pastor Mitchell hesitated. Something told her to hold on to it. "No, let me keep it for now. Maybe someone will recognize it." She placed the pager in her office desk drawer and forgot about it for 3 days. It wasn't until Wednesday evening, while reviewing old church records for an upcoming anniversary celebration, that she came across a file marked Missing Persons, 1997. Inside was a copy of the police report for Emma Willis, complete with photographs and witness statements. Pastor Mitchell stared at Emma's senior portrait, the bright blue eyes, the golden hair, the confident smile of a young woman ready to change the world. She had heard Margaret's story many times, but seeing Emma's face made the tragedy feel immediate and real. On impulse, she opened her desk drawer and pulled out the pager. The numbers on the tape seemed to stare back at her. 4, 7, 15, 20, 8. Could this possibly be connected to Emma's disappearance? It seemed impossible, but the timing of its discovery, exactly 22 years later, felt like more than coincidence. Pastor Mitchell called Detective Chen, who was now a lieutenant with the Riverside Police Department. Chen agreed to meet at the cathedral the next morning to examine the pager. "Where exactly was this found?" Lieutenant Chen asked, following Carlos down to the basement storage area. "Right here." Carlos pointed to the space behind the cabinet. It was wedged way back there like it had been dropped and forgotten. Lieutenant Chen examined the area with a flashlight. The basement had a separate entrance from the main cathedral, a side door that led directly outside. Someone could theoretically enter and exit this area without going through the main sanctuary. The numbers on the tape, Chen mused, photographing the pager from every angle. 4, 7, 15, 28. Could be a date, a code, coordinates, anything really. She sent the pager to the forensics lab, though after 22 years the chances of finding usable fingerprints or DNA were slim. The real mystery was the sequence of numbers. Chen spent hours trying different interpretations, dates, phone numbers, addresses, even mathematical equations. Nothing seemed to fit. It was Margaret who provided the breakthrough. When Pastor Mitchell gently told her about the discovery, Margaret's face went pale. "May I see it?" she whispered. Pastor Mitchell handed her the pager, and Margaret's fingers traced the faded numbers on the tape. Her eyes filled with tears. "These numbers," she said, her voice barely audible. 4, 7, 15, 28. Emma used to write everything in code when she was younger. She was fascinated by puzzles, by hidden meanings. Margaret paused, her mind racing back through decades of memories. She always said that if she ever needed to leave a message that only I would understand, she would use our special system. "What system?" Lieutenant Chen asked gently. Margaret closed her eyes, remembering. A equals 1, B equals 2, and so on. She would write messages in numbers instead of letters. We used to pass notes to each other during boring family dinners. She looked down at the pager again. 4, 7, 15, 28. That would be DGOTH. The letters hung in the air, meaningless to everyone except Margaret. Her face crumpled as understanding dawned. "Digoth," she repeated. It's not a word, it's a place. Duluth, Georgia. Our old house number was 1508 on Duluth Garden Drive. We lived there when Emma was little before we moved to Riverside. She always called it DGOTH because she couldn't pronounce Duluth properly when she was 5 years old. The drive to Duluth, Georgia took Margaret and Lieutenant Chen 4 hours. Margaret sat in the passenger seat clutching the pager like a lifeline, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. What would they find? Was Emma really there? Or was this just another dead end in a case that had consumed 22 years of her life? Lieutenant Chen had contacted the Duluth Police Department explaining the situation. Detective Maria Santos, a bilingual officer with experience in missing persons cases, agreed to meet them at the old address on Duluth Garden Drive. The neighborhood had changed dramatically since the Willis family had lived there in the early 1990s. What had once been a quiet residential area was now bustling with new developments and shopping centers. The small ranch house at 1508 Duluth Garden Drive looked smaller than Margaret remembered, its white paint faded and the garden overgrown. The current owners are the Rodriguez family, Detective Santos explained as they stood on the sidewalk. They've lived here for about 15 years. I spoke with Mrs. Rodriguez this morning. She's willing to let us look around, but she doesn't know anything about the previous residents. Margaret's heart pounded as they approached the front door. Mrs. Rodriguez, a kind woman in her 50s, welcomed them with nervous hospitality. She had heard about their search and was eager to help, though she seemed puzzled by the connection to her home. We've done some renovations over the years, Mrs. Rodriguez explained as she led them through the house. New kitchen, updated bathrooms, converted the garage into a family room, but the basic structure is the same. Margaret walked through the rooms like a ghost visiting her past. The living room where Emma had built blanket forts, the kitchen where they had shared countless meals. Emma's old bedroom, now painted pink and belonging to the Rodriguez's youngest daughter. Is there anywhere Emma might have hidden something? Lieutenant Chen asked. A special place that only she would know about? Margaret closed her eyes, trying to remember. Emma had been 7 when they moved away from this house. She had been heartbroken to leave, crying for days about abandoning her secret places. The oak tree, Margaret said suddenly. In the backyard. Emma had a special hiding spot in the old oak tree. She used to leave notes for the fairies there. They went outside to the backyard, where the massive oak tree still dominated the landscape. Its trunk was even thicker now, its branches reaching higher into the sky. Margaret approached it slowly, her fingers tracing the bark until she found what she was looking for, a small hollow about 4 feet from the ground, partially hidden by the tree's natural growth. She used to put her treasures here, Margaret whispered. Shiny rocks, pressed flowers, little toys. Detective Santos carefully examined the hollow with a flashlight. At first it appeared empty except for old leaves and debris. But as she probed deeper, her fingers encountered something solid, wrapped in what felt like plastic. She pulled out a small package carefully wrapped in multiple layers of plastic bags to protect it from the elements. Inside was a folded piece of paper and a small key. Margaret's hands shook as she unfolded the paper. The handwriting was unmistakably Emma's, the same careful script she had used for her medical school applications. The note was dated October 15, 1997, 3 days after Emma's disappearance. Mom, if you're reading this, then you found my message in the pager and remembered our old code. I'm sorry I had to leave without explaining, but I didn't have a choice. I'm safe, but I can't come home yet. The key is for storage unit 247 at Secure Store on Highway 85 in Duluth. Everything you need to know is there. I love you more than all the stars in the sky. Emma. The storage facility was only 10 minutes away. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as they drove through the familiar streets of her past. Secure Store was a large complex of orange and white buildings, row upon row of metal doors protecting people's belongings. Unit 247 was in the back section, away from the main office. The key turned easily in the lock, and the metal door rolled up with a grinding sound that seemed to echo Margaret's 22 years of waiting. Inside the small unit were boxes, carefully labeled and organized. But what caught Margaret's attention immediately was the wall covered with photographs, newspaper clippings, and documents. It looked like a detective's investigation board, with red string connecting various pieces of information. In the center of it all was a recent photograph of Emma. She was older now, 39 instead of 17, but unmistakably the same person. Her golden hair was shorter, pulled back in a practical ponytail, Her blue eyes held a depth of experience that hadn't been there at 17. She was wearing scrubs and a stethoscope, standing in front of what appeared to be a medical clinic. Below the photograph was an address: Free Clinic of Northern Georgia, 1247 Mountain View Road, Dahlonega, GA. Lieutenant Chen photographed everything while Margaret stood frozen, staring at her daughter's face. Emma had achieved her dream. She had become a doctor. But why had she stayed away? Why had she let her mother suffer for 22 years? Among the documents were newspaper clippings about Margaret, showing her at various vigils and anniversary remembrances for Emma's disappearance. There were also medical school transcripts under the name Emily Watson, graduation certificates, and what appeared to be a detailed explanation written in Emma's handwriting. Margaret picked up the letter with trembling hands and began to read her daughter's words. Words that would finally explain 22 years of silence and pain. The letter in Margaret's hands contained Emma's truth, written in the same careful handwriting that had once filled medical textbooks and college applications. Mom, by the time you read this, you'll have found me, or I'll have found the courage to come home. I left that Sunday because I discovered something that changed everything. Pastor Williams wasn't the man we thought he was. I had stayed after church the week before to study in the library when I overheard him on the phone, talking about moving money, about keeping secrets. When I tried to leave, he saw me. He told me I had heard things I shouldn't have, things that could destroy the church and hurt many people. He said I needed to disappear for a while, until things settled down. He wasn't threatening me, Mom, but I was 17 and scared. I thought if I left temporarily, I could protect you and the congregation from whatever scandal was brewing. I never meant for it to be forever. Margaret's hands shook as she continued reading. I took the bus to Duluth because it was the only place I could think of where I felt safe. I got a job at a diner, saved money, and eventually managed to get into medical school under a different name. I became Emily Watson because I was too afraid to be Emma Willis. Every year I told myself I would come home next year when I was stronger, when I could face the questions. But the years kept passing, and the longer I stayed away, the harder it became to explain. I've been watching from a distance, Mom. I know about your vigils, your pain, your unwavering faith that I was still alive. You were right. I was always alive, and I was always thinking of you. The drive to Dahlonega took another hour. Margaret sat in silence, processing 22 years of misunderstanding and misdirected grief. Emma hadn't been taken or harmed. She had been protecting everyone she loved in the only way her 17-year-old mind could conceive. The Free Clinic of Northern Georgia was a modest building nestled in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. It served the rural communities where medical care was often scarce and expensive. A small sign by the entrance read, Dr. Emily Watson, Family Medicine. No one turned away for inability to pay. Lieutenant Chen waited in the car while Margaret walked to the entrance on unsteady legs. Through the glass doors, she could see a waiting room filled with families, elderly farmers, young mothers with children, workers in paint-stained clothes. This was where her daughter had ended up, serving the people who needed her most. The receptionist, a young woman with kind eyes, looked up as Margaret approached. Are you here to see Dr. Watson? She's with a patient right now, but I can put you on the list. Please tell her. Margaret's voice caught in her throat. Tell her that Margaret Willis is here to see her. The receptionist's expression changed to one of confusion, then recognition, then something close to shock. She disappeared down a hallway, and Margaret could hear urgent whispers from behind closed doors. 5 minutes later, a door opened, and Emma emerged. She was taller than Margaret remembered, or perhaps Margaret had simply grown smaller with age. Emma's golden hair was streaked with early silver, and her blue eyes held the weight of 2 decades of experience. She wore simple scrubs and comfortable shoes, the uniform of someone who spent her days caring for others. For a moment, neither woman moved. They stood in the waiting room of a rural clinic, surrounded by strangers who had no idea they were witnessing a miracle 22 years in the making. Emma spoke first, her voice barely a whisper. Mom. Margaret crossed the space between them in 3 quick steps and wrapped her arms around the daughter she had never stopped believing in. Emma was solid and real and alive, smelling faintly of antiseptic and the lavender soap she had always preferred. They held each other while the waiting room continued around them. Patients checking in, children playing with worn toys, the ordinary business of healing and hope. Margaret felt Emma's tears on her shoulder and realized she was crying too. 22 years of grief and relief pouring out in a small clinic waiting room. "I'm sorry," Emma whispered against her mother's hair. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I was just a scared kid who thought she was protecting everyone. I never meant for it to go on this long." Margaret pulled back to look at her daughter's face, memorizing the changes that time had brought. "You became a doctor," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "You achieved your dream." Emma nodded, wiping her eyes. "I help people who can't afford to go anywhere else. It's not Harvard, but it's where I'm needed." "It's perfect," Margaret said and meant it. "You're perfect." They talked for hours that day, filling in 22 years of separation. Emma had indeed witnessed Pastor Williams involved in financial improprieties, embezzling church funds to cover gambling debts. Her teenage decision to disappear had been misguided, but well-intentioned. Williams had been quietly removed from his position a year later when the church board discovered the missing money. But by then, Emma was too deep into her new life to know how to return. She had put herself through medical school, working multiple jobs, driven by the same determination that had once filled her high school textbooks. She had never married, never had children, dedicating herself entirely to her patients and her guilt over the pain she had caused her mother. "I drove by the house sometimes," Emma admitted as they sat in her small office after the clinic closed. "I saw you at the vigils on the news. I wanted to come home so many times, but I didn't know how to face what I had done." Margaret took her daughter's hands that had healed countless patients, hands that had never stopped being her little girl's hands. "You were 17, sweetheart. You were trying to do the right thing with the information you had, I understand now." As the sun set over the Georgia mountains, Margaret and Emma began the slow process of rebuilding their relationship. There would be questions from the police, media attention, and the challenge of explaining Emma's return to a community that had mourned her for over 2 decades. But in that moment, sitting in a small clinic where her daughter had spent years healing others, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced since October 12, 1997. Complete peace. Her daughter was alive, she was helping people, and she was finally ready to come home. The pager that had started it all sat on Emma's desk, its faded numbers a testament to a daughter's love and a mother's unwavering faith. Sometimes the longest journeys lead us exactly where we need to be, even when the path takes 22 years to reveal itself. Emma Willis had vanished from a church in 1997, but Dr. Emily Watson had emerged to serve those who needed her most. Now, finally, they could both go home.